They called her nothing, in the end. Not even that. A name struck from the registry, a fire kicked out, a woman shoved through the keep's eastern gate while snow came down sideways and the crowd stood and watched the door shut behind her. That was the year 893 of the Lycan reckoning, on the night of the Hollow Frost Rite, when the Ashvale pack condemned Sable of the Erased Line and left her to the cold. What they did not know, what none of them could have calculated in their sealed tribunals and their forged registries, was that the cold had a king in it that night. He was not looking for her. He was not looking for anyone. The Lycan king traveled the Grey Marrow Road without escort because he trusted no escort, and because the wolfsbane lodged in his left side had been working on him for 2 days, and he had not yet decided what that would cost him. He found her at the frozen gorge, face down in the frost-hardened mud, barefoot, her shift gray with cold. He could have left her. Every calculation he had ever made about survival suggested leaving her. He lifted her instead. If you want to know why the most feared man in the Lycan world knelt before a cast-out Omega before the year was done, then stay with this story, because the answer begins not in a throne room and not in a bed, but in the snow beside a gorge that had no name, on a night when the hollow frost moon hung red and full above the black pines, and nothing about any of it was an accident. The Hollow Frost Rite, in the year 893, fell on the 16th night of the deep freeze, when the Ashvale pack gathered in its great hall to reaffirm bonds, hear disputes, and settle the business of blood. It was not a night for the condemned. Sable had not expected to be condemned. She had stood at the edge of the assembly that morning and watched the elders file in under their gray hoods, and she had thought, as she always did, that this ritual was not for her, that she was a kennel servant's companion and a healer's apprentice, and a woman without a wolf rank, and that she would carry wool into the back corridor and come out again unremarked. She had been wrong about herself in precisely that way for 3 years running, and she would be wrong about herself one final time. High Warden Aldrich called her name at the second bell. She knew his voice the way she knew cold, as a thing that came from outside and did not ask permission. Aldrich was a wide man, silver-haired, with the practiced stillness of someone who had never in his life been denied what he wanted. He stood on the raised platform at the hall's northern end, flanked by 2 registry elders and by Marin, his betrothed, who wore a red and white cape that cost more than Sable had ever owned. Marin had sharp bones in her face and the particular expression of someone who has already decided how a thing ends. The charge was treason. Specifically, the passing of pack border routes to agents of the eastern lowlands. Sable stood in the center of the stone floor with torchlight pressing down on her from the iron chandeliers above, and she heard the charge, and she understood immediately that it was constructed. The routes named were routes she had never walked. The registry document held up before the elders was in a hand that looked like hers only if you had never read her actual writing. She said as much. She said it precisely, without raising her voice, naming the specific document she had filed with the healer's record that season, and the date it bore. Aldrich let her finish speaking. He had a talent for that, for letting people speak themselves into the silence, and then filling the silence with something that made their words irrelevant. He held up the registry sheet and said, in the carrying voice he reserved for pronouncements, that the condemned's own mark was on the document, and that the condemned was known to be wolfless, lineage erased, and without a single witness of standing to speak for her character. He paused after that last clause. The hall took the pause and held it. Marin leaned in from her seat at the side of the dais and said, cleanly enough for the front rows to hear, that one expected no better from traitor's blood. The phrase landed and did not leave. Sable felt it land in her chest like a stone dropped in still water, the concentric rings moving outward and outward, and she stood still in the center of the floor and did not let her face change, because she had learned early that keeping her face still was the only form of dignity the Ashvale pack could not take from her. The elders voted in less time than it took to stoke a fire. Lineage erased, bond severed, name struck from the registry. Cast out before the Hollowfrost rite concluded, which meant cast out that night, which meant cast out into a winter that had already killed 2 wolves that week who were stronger than she was. Bryn was at the edge of the crowd. She was a short woman, broad-shouldered, with the weathered look of someone who had spent 30 years in the kennel yard and had outlasted everyone who had ever been unkind to her. She had been Sable's one fixture in the Ashvale years, the woman who had kept Sable fed when the senior healers forgot her rations, who had pressed a good wool cloak into her hands 2 winters ago and pretended it was a spare. Bryn pushed forward through the crowd as the guards took Sable by the arms, and she caught Sable's hand for 1 second and pressed her fingers hard. "Walk straight," Bryn said. Just that. Then the guards pulled Sable forward and Bryn was swallowed back into the crowd, and the great hall doors opened onto the night, and the cold came in. If you are watching this and you have ever stood in a room where the verdict was already decided before you walked in, let this story be yours tonight. Tell me in the comments. Now back to the gorge, back to the night, back to the red moon and the woman who walked into the snow without shoes, because they had not left her time to put them on. The Grey Marrow Road ran northeast from the Ashvale Gate and dropped steeply through Black Pine Forest before leveling out at the gorge. Sable knew the road. She had walked it on healer's errands in the autumn, carrying medicine pouches through the pine dark, and she knew that the gorge bridge was 3 miles from the gate, and that the only shelter past it was the hunting lodge the Ashvale pack maintained for visiting dignitaries, a lodge that would be locked and cold and probably occupied by no one on a hollow frost night. She made the bridge in just under an hour, moving fast to stay warm, her feet going numb before the first mile. The moon was at its height when the cold crested and she felt her legs go uncertain beneath her. The kind of failure that arrives not as pain, but as a simple absence, the body quietly ceasing to contract the muscles it needs. She went down at the gorge's edge, one hand catching the iron railing of the bridge, the railing burning cold against her palm, and then the railing was gone and the mud was against her cheek, and the red moon hung enormous in the black sky above her, and she thought, with a clarity she would not have predicted in her final moment, that Bryn had pressed her fingers very hard, and that she was glad of it. She heard his footsteps before she saw him. Not the light footstep of a scout, or the hurried step of a traveler in the cold, but something slower and deliberate. The step of a man who was already in pain and had organized himself around it. He came down the road from the north, which meant he had been on the lodge side of the gorge, and he stopped when he reached her. She could not turn her head well enough to see his face. She registered height, the shadow of him across the snow being the shadow of a man built like a keep wall, and she registered that he did not speak immediately, and that the not speaking was not indifference but calculation. Then he crouched, and she could see him, and what she saw was Darius Darkhollow, whom she knew from a commission portrait hung in the Ashvale Great Hall, and from the particular stillness that gathered around his name when elders spoke it. He was younger than the portrait. The portrait had ironed everything from his face that made it readable, the line between his brows, the set of his mouth, the quality of absolute concentration he wore like armor. He had a riding coat over what looked like blood-soaked wrapping at his left side, and his breathing was shallow and deliberate, the breathing of someone managing something serious. His eyes, when they met hers, were the gray amber of forge-cooled iron, and they held on her face for 3 full seconds with an expression she could not name, something between a clinician's assessment and a thing considerably less controlled. He picked her up, not tenderly, not gently, with the impersonal efficiency of a man who has decided a thing must be done and is doing it. 2 hands, sure grip, her weight lifted and carried without comment. She was too cold to protest, and clear-headed enough to understand that protest would be pointless in any case. He carried her up the road to the lodge, kicked the door open, laid her on the hearthrug closest to the cold hearth, and began building a fire with the focused speed of someone who understood the hour was serious. The lodge was stone-built and cedar-furnished, clearly kept in some supply, with a wood stack along one wall and sealed provision crates stacked below the east window. A single oil lamp sat on the central table. Darius lit the fire, lit the lamp, turned back to her, and said, in the tone of a man issuing a duty assignment, "Tell me what you need." She told him, blankets from the chest under the window, the provision crate with the blue wax seal, which she recognized as a healer's supply mark, warm water from whatever he could heat over the fire. He produced all three without asking why she knew what she knew, which was the first thing he did that she filed away without understanding. She was a healer's apprentice, trained by the Ashvale Pack's secondary healer for 3 years before the woman died and left her with practical knowledge and no formal standing. She knew what cold did to a body's extremities, and she knew how to reverse it if caught in time. She worked on herself with her hands and the blankets while the fire built, and she did not speak. And Darius sat on the low cedar bench by the woodstack with his back to the wall, and watched her with the gray-amber eyes and did not speak either. It was when she was warm enough to perceive the full situation that she understood the wound. She saw it clearly when he shifted his position on the bench to reach for the lamp, the riding coat pulling open and the wrapping showing dark and wet. She knew wolfsbane by its smell before she saw the staining, a particular sour smoke odor that every healer knew, a plant-based poison that lodged in Lycan flesh like a splinter and worked upward into the blood over days. At moderate concentration, it caused fever, confusion, and a progressive weakening of the wolf form. At high concentration, it was lethal inside a week if untreated. "You have wolfsbane in that wound," she said. He looked at her for a moment as though she had told him something he already knew and had hoped not to hear confirmed by a second party. "I know," he said. "How long?" 2 days. She sat up properly and looked at him across the fire. "I can treat it. The provision crate with the blue seal has powdered iron bark in it, which will draw the toxin to the surface if I pack the wound correctly. It will hurt." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something more like the acknowledgement that she had said something logical in a register he had not expected. "Do it," he said. That was how she came to have her hands inside a wound belonging to the most feared Lycan king in the known territories, on the night the Hollowfrost Rite cast her out of the only home she had left. She worked with the efficiency her training had given her, soaking the powdered iron bark into the wound packing, watching the characteristic smoke rise from the flesh where the toxin met the compound, thin and silver-gray in the firelight. Darius did not flinch once. He sat with his back against the stone wall and breathed with measured deliberation, and she packed the wound in 4 careful layers, and her hands smelled of silver and iron bark for an hour afterward. "You have healer's training," he said, when she had finished tying the clean wrapping. "I did." "Did." "The Ashvale Pack stripped my standing tonight." He was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved across her face in a way she did not entirely know how to interpret, cataloging something, or trying to. "Why?" She told him the charge, and he heard it without expression. She watched his face carefully, looking for belief or disbelief, and found neither, which was not what she expected. He received the information the way a general receives a field report, as data, not as judgment, and set it somewhere internal to examine later. "You're sleeping here tonight," he said. It was not a question. He crossed to the provision crates and returned with dried venison and a sealed jar of pressed grain, which he set on the hearthrug beside her, and then he took the bench again and closed his eyes. She watched the fire for a long time before she slept. The next morning she changed the wound packing and found the smoke diminished, which meant the iron bark was working. Darius sat for the procedure with his eyes on the ceiling and his jaw set, and when it was done and she had retied the wrapping, he said, without looking at her, "You were steady." She understood from his tone that this was not a compliment in the usual sense, not a grace bestowed, but an observation made by someone for whom steadiness was a professional criterion. "I was trained to be," she said, "by someone in the Ashvale pack. By Healer Corwith. She's dead." He nodded once and said nothing further, and she thought that would be the end of it. But in the afternoon, when the snow had lightened and she had taken the provision inventory as a way to make herself useful, she heard him say from the bench where he was sitting with his eyes open and his attention on some middle distance she could not find, "Corwith treated a border delegation 12 years ago. I met her. She was a careful woman." Sable stood with a jar of salted oil in each hand and looked at him, and he did not look back. And she understood that this was as close as he was going to come in a first conversation, to saying that he had heard of her teacher, that her teacher had been respected, and that this connected to something he was not yet prepared to name. She put the jars back. On the second night the fever spiked in him, which she had expected. Wolfsbane, even when being drawn out correctly, released secondary compounds into the blood during the extraction process. She woke to the sound of his controlled, rapid breathing and found him sitting upright on the bench with sweat across his forehead, and his eyes fixed on the door with the focused intensity of someone whose body is frightening him and who refuses to allow the fear to pass his face. She boiled the remaining ironbark powder into a compress and sat beside him on the bench to hold it against the wound with sustained pressure, which was the only thing that helped in a fever spike, and he let her, which told her more about his actual condition than anything else had. He smelled like cedar bark and heated iron, and something underneath those, something she could not name and could not stop noticing, a scent that did not belong to the cold or the wood or the fire. She noticed it the first night and dismissed it. She noticed it the second night and recognized that she was noticing, which disturbed her in ways she kept below the surface. She sat with the compress held firm and his shoulder against hers. And she felt, at the point of contact, a warmth that was not entirely the fever. It moved up her arm and settled in her chest like banked coals, and she looked at the fire and kept her face still in the way she had learned to keep it still, and she told herself it was the cold and the relief of being warm, and nothing more than that. His hand came up and covered hers where it held the compress. He was not looking at her. She was almost certain he was not entirely awake. But his hand was there, large and scarred across the knuckles, holding her hand and the compress together without any instruction from a conscious will, and she sat completely still, and the fire burned down an inch before either of them moved. "You should sleep," she said. His hand did not move immediately. When it did, it moved slowly, as though whatever had placed it there had to be recalled deliberately. He did not speak. He lowered himself to his side on the bench and was asleep in minutes, with the particular depth of someone whose body has been waiting for permission, and Sable sat beside him in the firelight with her hand still warm where his had been, and she was very careful not to understand what she was feeling. On the third day he was coherent and cooler, the wound smoke nearly gone when she changed the packing, which meant the toxin was at its surface layer and the worst was past. He had asked her that morning, in the matter-of-fact way he asked everything, what she knew about Ashvale's eastern border routes, and she had told him. Not the routes she had been accused of sharing, but the ones she actually knew from healers' errands, and he had listened with his particular quality of complete attention, and afterward she understood that he had been doing two things simultaneously, gathering geographic intelligence and trying to find the shape of her character from how she answered questions. She did not mind. She was doing the same thing. He spoke about the Ashvale Border Pact on the third afternoon, more than he likely would have with anyone else, because the lodge was small and the cold was immense, and 3 days of proximity had eroded the usual architecture of formal distance. He needed Ashvale's eastern pass for supply lines into the high territories. He had been traveling to negotiate the terms when the Wolfsbane arrow had found him, shot by someone he had not yet identified, from a hillside he had passed a dozen times on prior rides. He said this with the flat tone of a man noting a problem he intended to solve, not a man who has been shaken. She said because she could not stop herself. Someone in Ashvale knew your route. He looked at her steadily. That is a very specific inference. You said you didn't take an escort because you don't trust your escorts. You would have varied your route to match that caution. Someone who knew your habits would have needed inside information about your variation, not your standard path. He was quiet for a long moment. You have a precise mind, he said. I was told my mind was my only asset, so I kept it sharp. Something in his expression shifted, not the cataloging look he usually wore, but something underneath it, a fractional tightening at the edges that she might have missed if she were not already watching too carefully. He did not answer. He turned back to the window and the snow-covered pine brake, and she returned to her provision inventory, and neither of them addressed what had just moved through the room. On the fourth night, the last before he told her he would have to leave, she woke at the second watch to find him standing at the east window with his coat on. The wound was nearly healed, the iron bark had done its work, and he stood with the posture of a man who has recovered his full height and is remembering what it feels like. He heard her sit up and did not turn. I leave in the morning, he said. The pact negotiation. Yes. She sat with her knees drawn up and watched his reflection in the dark window glass. He was looking at it too, which meant they were watching each other in the glass, and neither was quite willing to turn and do it directly. You could stay here until the weather lifts, he said, and she understood from the particular care with which he said it that he was giving her something and not framing it as giving. I have nowhere to go after that, she said. I know. He turned from the window then and looked at her directly, in the firelight, across the small cold room, and whatever he had been keeping behind the cataloging expression was visible for one unguarded second. Want and recognition and something older than either. And then he folded it away, carefully, behind the formal distance that was his natural architecture, and he said, I will not leave you without a path forward. She said, You owe me nothing. He said, No, and left it there, and she was not certain which of them he was correcting. He left before first light. If you are still with this story, you will want to know what happens next, and I will tell you. But first, I want you to know what Bryn had done in the hours after the tribunal, because it matters. While the guards were marching Sable through the great hall doors and the assembly was dispersing back to the Hollow Frost feast, Bryn went to the room where Sable had slept for 3 years. She went quickly, and she went knowing she had perhaps 20 minutes before Aldrich's men came to seal it. She did not take the wool blanket or the carved wooden box that had belonged to Sable's mother, or any of the things that were visible and obvious. She went to the loose floor stone in the east corner that she had helped Sable reset once during a flooding winter, and she took what was underneath it. A flat oilskin packet sealed with dark wax, bearing no name on its outside, which Bryn knew contained a document she had never read but had helped hide 5 years ago when Sable's mother pressed it into her daughter's hands on the night the Ashvale pack erased their family line. Bryn hid the packet in her apron and walked out of the room and did not run, because she had outlasted everyone who had ever been unkind to her, and she knew the value of an unremarkable pace. She kept it for 9 days. On the 5th day after Darius left the lodge, 3 of Aldrich's men arrived at the hunting ground. They came with hounds and tracking orders and the efficiency of people who had been told where to look. Sable heard the hounds first, and she had one moment of considering the cedar forest to the north, but the snow was deep, and her feet were still fragile from the first night, and she thought of Bryn saying, "Walk straight," and she opened the lodge door and stood in it and waited. They took her back to Ashvale at a pace that was not comfortable and a grip that was not gentle. And when they brought her through the great hall doors the second time, she was wearing a borrowed coat from the lodge's supply chest and no packmark, and the hall was half assembled because the tribunal had not yet been formally reconvened. Aldrich was there. He looked unsurprised, which meant he had expected to find her, which meant he had known she was at the lodge, which fed back into what she had said to Darius about the arrow being placed by someone who knew his habits. She filed that understanding away in the precise mind she had spent a life keeping sharp, and she stood in the center of the stone floor again and looked at Aldrich and waited. The charge was repeated. The forged registry document was presented again, held before the elders with the same steady confidence as before, the hand that looked like hers if you had never read her actual writing. A second charge was added now, shelter taken without right from a diplomatic property, meaning the lodge. The elders leaned together and murmured. Then the great hall doors opened and the cold came in again, and this time the cold had a king in it. Darius had not been expected at the tribunal. The Ashvale delegation had been told he was still 3 days north, delayed by weather, that the pact negotiation would reconvene on his arrival as scheduled. They had been told this by his chamberlain, who had received the information from Aldrich's courier, who had sent it 6 days ago when the Tribune plan was still theoretical. The information was, in every meaningful sense, fabricated, because Darius had ridden 2 days hard and arrived in Ashvale at the second bell of morning, and when he heard, at the keep's gate, that the cast-out woman from the gorge had been brought back before a tribunal, he came to the great hall without changing his coat. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and the hall went entirely still. His presence did the thing it did in rooms, the air reorganizing itself, the assembly's attention pivoting before conscious thought processed the cause. He was dusty from the road, and his jaw was tight, and he wore the expression Sable had seen on his face in the lodge only once, in the unguarded second at the window. Except here it was fully visible, stripped of the formal distance, and it was directed at Aldrich with an absolute focus that made several of the elders step back from the dais. He walked to the center of the hall and stopped, and said, in the carrying voice of a man who does not raise it because it does not need to be raised, "Continue." Aldrich continued, because Aldrich was a man who had calculated the probabilities and believed he had accounted for all variables. He held the forged registry document up and stated the condemned's name and lineage for the record, using the phrase, "traitor's blood," in the flat tone of someone citing an established fact. He looked at Darius while he said it, the steady look of a man issuing a test, watching for whether the king would flinch at proximity to contamination. What Sable saw, standing in the center of the floor, was that Darius did not look at the document. He looked at her, and in that look was the specific quality of a man who has already made a decision and is waiting to find out what it costs. Then Bryn walked through the side door. She came in from the corridor that served the kennel yard, still wearing her working apron, moving with the short, deliberate steps of a woman who had 9 days to think about this walk and had decided on her pace. She carried the oilskin packet against her side. She came to the center of the floor and stood 2 arms' lengths from Sable and looked at the elders and said, in the clear, carrying voice she had spent 3 decades in a kennel yard developing, "I have a document for this assembly." Aldrich's face did not move, but his right hand moved, toward the guard beside the dais. A small gesture the guard read correctly. Bryn saw it and kept talking. "It is a sealed registry document, original form, bearing the packmark of the Rosvane line before its erasure." She laid it on the floor of the hall, because the guard was already at her elbow. "Let an elder open it." The elder nearest the aisle went down on one knee and picked it up before the guard could prevent it. The hall stayed silent in the way it stays silent only when something irrevocable is in progress. The elder broke the wax seal, unfolded the document, and read for 30 seconds with his head bowed over the page. Then he looked up at Sable. The Rosvane line. Sable had known the name the way you know a name in a family story, the kind told in pieces across years until you understand it is not a story, but a history. The kind of history that someone decided was dangerous. Her mother had been Rosvane before the erasure, before Aldrich had brought the treason charge that stripped the line from the registry in the year 881, 12 years before Sable stood in this hall. The Rosvane pack mark was a secondary mark to the main Ashvale registry, meaning it could not be erased without pack council approval, meaning any document bearing it carried a claim that superseded a warden's tribunal authority, meaning Aldrich's tribunal had no jurisdiction over her at all. The elder said so in a voice that was considerably smaller than it had been 10 minutes prior. Aldrich moved then, quickly, the first uncontrolled movement she had seen from him. He put his hand on the forged registry document and began to speak about secondary authentications, about the established practices of erasure law, about the document in the elder's hands being of uncertain provenance. His voice was still steady. His hand on the forged document was not. Darius said, "Set that document on the dais." The room absorbed the instruction before Aldrich's conscious will could resist it. Two of the assembly elders moved to take the forged document from Aldrich's hands, and the senior elder crossed to the dais to lay it alongside the Rosvane document, and Aldrich stood in the center of his own tribunal with his hands empty and the comparison visible to everyone in the hall. The hand that looked like Sable's, if you had never read her actual writing. Against the original Rosvane document, under lamplight, examined now by 4 elders who had been doing registry work for decades, the forgery was not subtle. It was the work of someone who had spent considerable effort and achieved approximate accuracy, and approximate was enough, in a tribunal with no competing original. Now there was a competing original, and the discrepancy was the width of a road. One elder said it aloud. "This is not her hand." The second said, "The registry mark is the wrong generation. It predates the current scribes by 40 years. The third said nothing, but he stepped back from the dais and looked at Aldrich with the particular expression of a man revising an institutional loyalty in real time. Aldrich turned to Darius, because Darius was the only remaining variable that mattered. He used the formal register, the address he had saved for exactly this contingency, reminding the king of the political weight of the Eastern Pact, the supply lines, the strategic value of Ashvale's cooperation, the history of their alliance. He spoke for several minutes. He was a skilled speaker. He had been building this speech in his head for 9 days. Darius listened to all of it. Then he said, "The pact is void." The hall produced a sound that was not quite a sound. The collective intake of breath of 200 people absorbing the simultaneous deaths of 9 months of political negotiation. The warden fabricated evidence in a tribunal, arranged an ambush on a diplomatic route, and framed a woman under his pact's jurisdiction using a forged document. Darius said, "These are not the conditions under which I negotiate supply rights. These are the conditions under which I withdraw recognition." Aldrich said, "She is nothing. She is a wolfless omega with an erased line and no standing. You would dissolve a decades-long alliance over a nothing woman." Darius looked at him for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, which was the thing about his voice that was actually frightening. The way it got smaller as the stakes went up, as though the words required less force the more weight they carried. "I would," he said, "and I am. And there is one additional matter before this assembly." He crossed the hall floor. He moved through the packed assembly without looking at anyone in it, with the certainty of a man who has already located the center of gravity in the room and is walking toward it, and the center was Sable, standing in the place the tribunal had kept her, on the cold stone floor at the hall's heart. She felt him coming before she heard him, The warmth she had spent 4 nights in a lodge, quietly refusing to acknowledge arriving now ahead of him through the crowded air, and she stood very still and looked at his face, and understood from what was in it that the unguarded second at the window had not been an accident, had been precisely what it appeared to be, and that he had been choosing, all the way down the Grey Marrow Road in the winter dark, what to do with what he knew. He stopped in front of her. He was close enough that she could see the road dust on his jaw, and the line the wolfsbane fever had left under his eyes, the marks of a man who had ridden 2 days without sleep to arrive at a hall he should not have been in. Close enough that she could smell cedar bark and heated iron, and the thing underneath those that had no name, the thing she had spent 4 nights not understanding, and she understood it now, understood it in the way the body understands things before the mind has words, the recognition that moves up from the bones and not from the considered will. The Rosvane line is not erased, he said. It was suppressed by a warden acting in his own interest, and its documents are valid, and its member carries the standing of a pack lineage wrongfully condemned. He said this for the hall, for the record, for the elders who were writing it as he spoke. Then he said, more quietly, what he said next. I have known since the gorge. My wolf knew before I reached you. She held very still, because she was afraid of what her face would do if she did not. Sable of the Rosvane line, he said, and his voice carried to the back of the hall in the particular way a formal proclamation carries, amplified by stone and silence, and the weight of what everyone in the room understood was about to happen. Is my fated queen, recognized, claimed, and named before this assembly. Any hand raised against her is raised against the Lycan throne. The Hollowfrost Hall was silent for 3 full seconds. Then the senior elder went down on his knee. Then the elder beside him. Then the assembly, row by row, the way a field leans in a wind that has made up its mind, and the sound of it was not loud. It was the specific soft sound of 200 people folding, knees on stone and heads bowed, and it moved from the front of the hall to the back in the span of a long exhale, and by the time it reached the rear doors there was no one standing in the Ashvale Great Hall, except the condemned woman at its center, the king in front of her, and the 2 figures who had not yet moved. Aldrich stood at the dais with the empty hands and the expression of a man whose calculation has encountered a variable he refused to account for. Marin stood at his side with the red and white cape and the sharp bones in her face, and an expression Sable had never seen on her before, which was the expression of someone confronting the specific cost of contempt delivered carelessly in a public place before a crowd that remembers. Darius turned to look at Aldrich with the small, quiet voice waiting. The Pack Council relieved Aldrich of the wardenship before the night was out, the 3 dissenting elders moving with the speed of men who had been waiting for exactly this opening. The forged document was burned in the hall's central brazier. Marin was formally stripped of her pack voice, which was the Ashvale Council's term for the ceremonial standing that gave a high-ranked female the right to speak at tribunal, removed not as punishment but as consequence. The straightforward cost of a named contempt delivered in a formal proceeding before a witness list that now included the Lycan king. She did not speak after the council's announcement. She sat very still in her red and white cape, and Sable did not look at her again, because there was nothing more that needed to be done in that direction. Aldrich was bound and placed under Pack Council custody before the Hollowfrost rite concluded, charged with fabricated treason against a pack member, interference with a diplomatic route, and conspiracy against the Lycan throne. The council's sentence came down 3 days later. Exile and lineage erasure, the same tools he had used, returned to him with the exactness of a verdict that has closed the circle. Bryn came to Sable after the hall had cleared, moving through the departing crowd with her short, deliberate steps, and her working apron still tied at the waist. She came and stood beside her, and looked at the dais where Aldrich's documents had already been taken down, and she said, "Well," Sable said, "you kept it for 5 years." 6, if you count from when your mother first gave it to me. Why didn't you tell me? Bryn was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when she was deciding how much of a thing to say. Because you would have used it too early, she said finally. Before there was someone in that room who had the weight to make it mean something. Your mother knew that. She told me to wait for the wait. Sable looked at her. She knew there would be wait. Bryn met her eyes with the steady look of a woman who had spent 30 years outlasting everyone unkind to her. She knew you, she said. That was enough. The Lycan throne's formal recognition of the Rosvane claim required a separate ceremony at the winter capital, and there were papers to file and seals to affix, and a good deal of cold riding between Ashvale and the High Territories in the days that followed. Sable did not know all the machinery of it, and she was honest with herself that she did not want to spend her attention on the machinery when there was the rest of it to manage. The specific interior work of a woman, learning that the floor she had always known was not the only floor, that there were rooms above it she had not been told about. Darius was not a man who explained himself at length. She had learned that in 4 nights of lodge proximity, and she had learned that the explanations he did not give were present in other registers, in the questions he asked when he could order, in the specific attention he gave to a room's temperature before she had the chance to notice it herself, in the way he had ridden 2 days without sleep to arrive at a hall he had no formal reason to be in. She asked him once why he had not left her at the gorge. He was quiet long enough that she thought the question would go unanswered, and then he said, in the tone of a man reporting an observation about the physical world, "My wolf would not move." She understood this as a complete answer. They rode out of Ashvale together on the 7th morning, down the Grey Marrow Road, through the black pine forest, toward the gorge where the bridge railing was still cold to the touch. The winter had not broken, but the worst of the freeze had lifted, and the red moonlight was different now. The hollow frost passed, the world in the ordinary gray of deep winter rather than the terrible ceremonial dark that had held it for 16 nights. At the gorge, Sable stopped her horse. She looked down at the mud of the bank, still marked with the impression of a body that had gone down and not risen under its own strength. She looked at the frost-laced railing. She looked at the frozen water below the bridge, the ice cracked now at its edges, the black current visible beneath. She had come down here with nothing, and she had not risen under her own strength, and she was still here, which were all true, which did not cancel each other. Darius stopped beside her and did not ask why she had stopped. After a time, she took her right hand off the reins and held it open, palm up, in the cold air between them. Not asking, offering the choice. The choice was his in the way that mattered, the way that costs something in its making, and she knew now that he understood costs. His scarred hand came across the space and covered hers. The gorge lay behind them in the winter light, the cracked ice and the frozen mud and the mark of the night. The Ashvale pack had decided she was nothing, and Bryn's horse came up behind them on the road, the old woman's breath fogging in the cold and her working apron exchanged finally for a riding coat of decent wool, and the 3 of them rode north together toward the High Territories and the throne.